We're live. We are live here.
Are we?
We are live. Just went live. So it's a solid us on a Thursday afternoon. Nobody is watching currently.
No quite yet.
That's okay. I think it needs to go up. Yeah. Fair enough. Oh, there's one person. Let us know who you is. Oh, it's probably Andrew. Oh, there's the second
not
person.
Not on.
Neither one of them is
Neither
Andrew.
one is me.
Wow. You guys should really shout out in the comments. Let me know. So at least I can say hi, not be a weirdo. Oh, it's Katie. Hi, Katie.
What up?
How's it going? How's your dad doing? Hope he's not mad at me.
No context.
Yep. You know, I'm really glad I was able to drop off that gift card at Katie's house there. But you roll up and you're like a grown adult person, and it's like a junior high girl's house. Context is key. So, yeah.
I lost the video.
Oh, good. I'm glad he's good. I enjoyed meeting him.
There we go.
What's happening? Okay.
I just turned the screen.
All right.
It
Yeah.
turns out super easily.
Classic. Well, don't touch it.
I'm sorry.
Well, it's your own fault. Was your week, I guess, since you weren't on the stream. Whatever.
Yeah.
What have you done? What was interesting?
So I live with another SI leader, David,
Alderman.
and we rent a 3-bedroom condo from Casey, another SI leader.
Yes,
And because Casey's roommate is getting married,
that's true.
he is moving back into his own condo with us.
Yes.
So it's the case, like, Casey says I'm a good roommate, but he moved out of his own condo to get away from me. So
But now he's moving back in.
Now he's moving
you
back
know,
in. So
it's a real
So
thing.
on top of like work stuff, there's also a degree of turning the storage room into a functional bedroom.
Yes.
Which means there's stuff. There's like years of like, I don't want to deal with this.
Yep.
That just got chucked in that room.
That's
And now I'll have to deal with it.
I like it. Katie, what's been going on in your life? Anybody else, if you're just new, you should sound off in the chat. Love to hear what's your week been like, or the last few days. If you watched our live feed on Tuesday, that we'd like to know just kind of how your week has been. We've missed you guys. That's why we do this stuff. Why we have been getting on the old YouTubes, and so it's super. Andrew is typing about a 35,000 sentence word long essay.
You know I like to over communicate.
Yeah, but don't. Just what I don't. All you have to do is okay. Well,
Like he just hit enter out of like frustration.
he wasn't
of
even
being
done.
called out.
Okay. Katie says nothing much. I watched on Tuesday. Yep, and I was laughing so hard.
A lot of board games and movie nights.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Anybody else, if you're on this and you're watching, we'd love to hear you on the live chat. We'd like to talk to you guys. Yeah, we started watching Star Wars at the Ward House. We started with the it's the first one, the first and worst. Hey, Paige! Hi.
By first, you mean
Yep.
numerically?
Yep.
Episodes.
It's
Ugh.
10 minutes is not the worst.
What is the worst?
Rise of Skywalker.
No. You still don't have anything that competes with Jar Jar.
Jar Jar's not that
Rose.
bad. He is.
Rose is
more
whatever.
worse in The Last Jedi, not The Rise of Skywalker.
She has like
Oh,
two
you
arcs. that is
you
not
are
apart.
correct. I am thinking of The Last Jedi. When
She
I said-
was nothing in The Last Jedi.
She
The
was.
Last Jedi she had more stuff to do in The Last Jedi than The Rise of Skywalker. The Last
Yeah.
Jedi was the
Oh,
second
that's right.
movie one.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Rise of Skywalker better than The Last Jedi.
This is not arguing about nothing here. This is our deep dive, our Thursday afternoon deep dive. And we are, oh, hey, Katie, Jar Jar is awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, BB-8 compared to Jar Jar is awesome. And BB-8 just by himself is a mythical creature. He can do anything.
He's not a
They
creature, he's a
took
robot.
what if we took the sass of R2D2
Yes.
and turned it kid friendly
Yep.
and like just all over the screen. And what I liked about R2D2 is that he was like sort of the sassy old man where he's like, yeah, I'll get this done, as opposed to BB-8 that's like the spunky droid.
Well, it is what it is. But today in our deep dive, we're talking about the resurrection. Specifically, evidences for. We'll talk about some of the arguments against and kind of just maybe how to have a conversation about it, maybe towards the end here. But that's kind of the thing. I'm joined with Josh. That's Josh. I'm Mike, if you didn't know. If you are not somebody who normally watches us, I'm proud of you for watching us. If you are somebody who normally watches us, I'm still proud that you decided to watch us. So we'll start with kind of our theme. So Josh, as we look at it, is the resurrection true? Is it a historical event? That's something we often talk about. So just in your opinion, your thoughts, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's way more evidences for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that those evidences aren't purely faith-based, that it's not a believe this because you need to, that are facts and reasons to believe in the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked about earlier that we won't actually be going into is whether or not Jesus existed. We currently will hold that there is so much historical truth about that particular instance that we are not going to talk about it. I just got a text. That's Pamela from whatever. I was thinking maybe it was Lindsay or Sarah telling us that we were doing something wrong.
She has a headache. She's not watching.
So anyway, so we're not going to really discuss those things. But I know that we've got the Bible, and that clearly, talks about the resurrection. But do we have any other historical sources that also talk about the resurrection?
So there are a couple where the existence of Jesus is brought up within a first century context. Like Josephus mentions that Jesus was a dude who existed and he died and stuff. Josephus was a first century Jewish historian who with Roman connections.
Yeah, he wrote such bangers as the Jewish War. It's real.
And so,
riveting read.
But there's an assumption in that question that the Bible itself cannot be read as a historical document. And that's just a false assumption.
So what do you mean by that?
So history, looking at something as history will often assume that, or they want to say that anything that makes religious claims can't be read as a religious document or as a historical document. Anything that deals with supernatural events can't be read as a historical document. And a lot of claims like that. But historical documents often, we have so many sources or so few sources through history. And a lot of those were like, that's propaganda, but this is a historical fact. We think of like the Trojan War, the retelling of that. Really, really long time after the event, some of the stuff we're like, that's clearly not what happened. But we can still read those and analyze them as you would analyze a historical document. And that's what really we're talking about. Can we analyze the New Testament as a historical document in the way historians analyze any document? And the answer is, of course, well, yeah, it's a document. You can analyze it historically.
Okay, so you brought up the Odyssey, right? Or so Homer's Iliad, right, is one of those where we consider it to be a historical document, but we say it's highly legend, right? Because it was written, the first copy that we have is about 400 to 500 years, I think, after the events took place. So that's where like people would say, well, the Trojan War happened, but of course, somebody gets shot in the,
Ankle and just kilo.
Yeah, die. But I think that leads to a really good sort of a follow-up question. If we're saying that they're on kind of par, are we really saying that the Bible is as reliable or historical as like the Odyssey? How historically reliable? how historical is the eyewitness account. So we're talking
So-
about the
Four
three synoptic gospels and the fourth John
Yeah.
added onto that one.
So, yeah, we can analyze them like a historical account. And when we do, we look for a couple of things. We look for what we want is we want independent sources where it's not like a cabal of people all writing the same thing in the same room. You know, we want independent accounts of what happened. And the more independent accounts, the more credibility that has. If only one person is saying a thing, it doesn't intrinsically make that thing untrue, but it's more likely to be true if someone unrelated to that guy is also saying this thing happened. We want contemporary accounts. So we want accounts to be as close to the event as possible. If we were to write a history about the 100 Years' War now, that would be a lot more difficult than people writing about it when it happened.
Yeah.
The closer you are to the timeline of time of the event, the more facts you have and the more fact checking there is because people were alive.
Yeah.
You know, if I was to claim that there were 3 planes that hit the Twin Towers, there are tons of people alive who are like, I saw the news footage, or I was there, or
I saw the news footage.
and so we know that one plane hit each tower. And so, you know, 500 years from now, if that footage no longer exists, like then we're taking it on, you know, accounts. And so we want sources as close to the event as possible.
Okay.
We want corroborating accounts. So we want these independent accounts, but we want them to be telling the same story. If Joe is saying it happened this way and Steve is saying it happened that way, then we're not getting more clarity on the subject. If anything, we're getting more confusion. We want them to agree. And we want unbiased accounts. And a lot of times this is used to discredit interested accounts, discredit people who believe in what they're writing. And there's a difference between bias and belief, right? Because if you said anything that was written, I refuse to read unless the author did not believe it, we would only be left with fiction. There would be no textbooks. There would be no scientific writings of any kind. There's a difference between believing in something and having a bias. A bias is when you have a personal gain, a personal stake in benefiting from the dissemination of the work being published on a large scale. You gain something personally from, or, you know, there is some benefit that you are receiving from this being published. And that doesn't always have to be like monetary. It could be like, I hate Romans, so I'm going to publish hate stuff about Romans.
Yeah.
Right. But a lot of times this assertion that belief equals bias is used to discredit the Bible. But if we're looking at it as, hey, is this an accurate representation of facts? Then why would you write that if you didn't believe it? And so there really is no way to write a nonfiction thing you don't believe in. And so the question is, why was it written? Was it written for the personal gain? Was it written for, you know, the disciples' benefit? Or was it written because this is the facts as they viewed them and they believed in them? And so
why don't we spend a little bit, I just, let's say a little bit of time on each one of those sort of statements. So the first one is, are there independent sources?
Okay. So a lot of times they want to say Matthew quoted Mark, Luke quoted Mark, Luke quoted Matthew. John was aware of all of these because he was written later. This means that they are not independent sources. But remember, if you watch the Old Testament video, you remember that I talked a little bit about how the Bible wasn't written by God mind controlling someone having them furiously scrawl out an entire work, and then they, come out of a trance or whatever, and they're like, oh, that's inspired word of God.
Mhm.
It was inspired by God, it was directed by God, but he used a very human means to put it together. And so when we talk about sources, we're not talking explicitly about the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Matthew, of John, of Paul's writings. We're also talking about what they cite, because it's not, they cite things in their Gospels.
Mhm.
For example, in the Gospel of Mark, part of his account of the trial and crucifixion, the way that it's worded speaks as though the high priest, who was at the time of this account, was the same high priest that was the high priest when Jesus was crucified. And that would mean that at the latest, this source of Mark's was written by AD 37, because the high priest Caiaphas was the high priest from AD 18 to 37, and Jesus was probably around AD 30 somewhere in terms of his crucifixion.
So again, that probably leads us into that second part of contemporary accounts.
Yeah.
Where one of the things I think that is important for us always to realize is that, and a lot of times when you study this, and when you study really anything, worldview really comes into account. And so, I think everybody looks at the same material, and what we want to know is how close were these eyewitness. I'm going to refer to them as eyewitness because they are from eyewitness accounts. Now, it's important that we note that all of the gospel writers except for John were like
Matthew was a disciple as well.
Okay. There you go. Mark and Luke are both like they followed other guys around and got their stories from other people, from eyewitness people would be the idea there.
So Mark, based on a early 2nd century description of the gospel, was Peter's interpreter and traveled with him and wrote all his stories down. Then when it came time to assemble a gospel, he used all that he had written down, and the stories of Jesus he had collected that he's traveling with Peter would have been verified by Peter.
Mhm.
And he assembled those into the Gospel of Mark. And so even though Mark himself didn't meet Jesus personally in a physical form, wasn't there for the resurrection, wasn't there for the empty tomb, we can still he is still citing eyewitness accounts.
Correct. So, and similar to that of say Luke, who was traveling around, he was the physician. He ended up traveling with
Paul for a long time.
And Peter as well, correct? So it's both. So it would make sense that then Luke shares with Mark and that sort of stuff. So contemporary accounts. So when do we think that these kind of things were written? Just brief sort of stuff.
We know that Luke was written. We just talked about how Mark cited stuff that was probably at least AD 37, but Mark itself probably wasn't written till within a couple of years, either before, after, within the time frame of Peter's martyrdom, which would have been very, very early 60 AD, 62-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And so, or 60.
61. Both Peter and Paul get martyred and James, or Jacob, as I learned, which is a leader.
Peter was
between
65.
61 to 65 AD. Yeah. They all got those three.
James was 62, Paul 64, Peter 65.
There you go.
And so it's thought that James, written, mid 60s,
mm-hmm.
Probably in Rome, to Rome, because there's some places where he explains things in a more Latin way as opposed to a Greek. But the other Gospels, so that's the earliest written Gospel. Let's look at Luke, which was written after Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
And now Luke was written before its paired volume Acts, because Luke Acts were written by the same guy, written together to tell the story of Jesus and then the story of the early church. And with Acts, we see that Acts ends before the martyrdom of Peter. before the martyrdom of Paul even. There's no mention to the martyrdom of James as well. And perhaps more specifically, in 70 AD, or in 66 AD, I should say, there was this revolt against Rome by Jewish zealots in Israel. And it culminated in 70 AD with the siege of Jerusalem, where Rome eventually just destroyed a ton. The temple was burned to the ground, a lot of destruction. And prior to this point in time, Christianity began in Jerusalem with the resurrection of Christ. The disciples were hanging out there. It was a lot of times it was their sort of central hub. It wasn't in the way of, say, a Catholicism where the Vatican is in Rome. It wasn't that sort of headquarters, but it was sort of the central location of Christianity. As example, in Acts 15 with the Council of Jerusalem, there was this council about, hey, what do we do with these Gentiles that are coming to Christ? Do they need to become Jews first? Do they need to, how do we even approach this? And we see that this church leadership council very naturally happens where the church is centered, which is Jerusalem. Acts 1:4, I believe, outline of Acts, they went from Jerusalem to Samaria, Judea, to the ends of the earth. It started in Jerusalem.
Which
And so
is an interesting thing of itself, but yeah.
So the destruction of the temple was significant because it scattered the early church, and they dispersed throughout, the Middle
region,
East.
yep.
Yeah. And it's a monumental event that goes back to, how Jesus said in the future they won't need to worship, in the mountain in Samaria or in the temple, because I'll be with them. Sort of paraphrasing the story of the woman at the well, something Jesus cited there in John. So the fact that we have this central figure of Judaism destroyed and would bring a lot of vindication to Christ's message, to what Christ said. And we're not seeing that in Acts. We're not seeing that in Luke. And Acts really follows, the first half of Acts follows the life of Peter and the ministry of Peter. Second half of Luke transfers and focuses on the life of Paul. And we don't see any sort of capstone to that. There's some verses that are perhaps ominous, but we're not being told of their martyrdom. And so we want to place them before those events that they aren't recording as historical books.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm listing the US presidents and I don't list anyone after Reagan, you're going to assume
Book was written before the next president took over office.
Yeah.
And so this is similar. So my assumption here, right, is you're making the case that the book of Acts is ending up written probably earlier than like 70 AD.
Yeah.
Or earlier than 66 AD.
You get a real condensed time frame, but it is probably within that pre-70, potentially pre-65, 64 AD. It's the case where the earlier you go, you start to butt heads with Mark, and there needs to be a little bit of time for the dispersal of Mark, the writing of Matthew, etc. But we have very good evidence that these are very early accounts, in the sense of, if Jesus died in 30, the temple was destroyed in 70, that's 40 years.
Yep.
That means people were still alive. Eyewitnesses were still alive.
Yeah.
We have, this isn't a case where there's a lot of room for mythological development.
Okay, so if we've gone through, our first one was saying, are they whatever individual accounts? The second one is, how closely were they written? So can we say that they were within kind of that? The third thing is there needs to be some corroborating accounts.
Yeah.
So now there are separate sources that tell a similar similar story.
Yeah. And something that's always interested me here is that one of the two of the arguments used to sort of refute this, one of them is, well, the Gospels look different. They're telling different things. That means they're wrong. And then another argument is, well, the Gospel authors collaborated. That means we can't take them as historical evidence. That means they're wrong. And you can't really have people collaborating and failing to corroborate at the same time.
Yep. So this is very similar to a guy, J. Warner Wallace, is a homicide detective, and he's now a pastor. He talks a lot about this, and so it's this idea of like eyewitnesses see things that are very similar. Okay, Josh and I, we were discussing this before. We were sitting in our office, and there was a box. Okay, it was a Frito-Lay.
It was a box we set out in youth group that had all the mixed chips in it.
Right. And when you look on one side, and I had some of it, I could see 7 little bags of chips, and I saw that they were 1 ounce, and I kind of described the box to him. And then he was like, well, one of the things you forgot is the box was blue. And so does the fact that we were telling a very similar story about a similar like item, now this is very, like, I want you to understand it's a very simple kind of argument here. But he was like, it's blue. And what was the other
It's
thing?
a classic fact.
Yeah.
It's got a barcode on the side I could see, but he couldn't.
So when you look at the eyewitness accounts and you see, well, are they corroborating? Which means they're not going to be exactly the same, but they're going to be like very similar. Okay. And so they're going to hold a lot of the main themes because they're covering the same things. They're just seen from different perspectives by different guys with through different lenses of the way that they viewed the world. And so that it's an important thing, to kind of get
The differences in the fine details are differences, not discrepancies. And so if you really take the time to piece them together, you can come to an understanding where it is they're not disagreeing with each other. They're just telling different stories as different witnesses would.
Okay. So, and then the last, are they unbiased?
And so with this, we want to go back to the does belief equal bias? And we say, well, what did the disciples gain from this message?
Mm-hmm.
They don't get any sort of worldly fame. In fact, there's a lot of scorn.
Yeah.
They don't get money. If anything, they're like, hey, give money to the poor. That's not a way to get rich.
That's true.
They're not pursuing this as a social way to get, say, women or status, or there's not a social motivation.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of these claims that because the disciples believe this, they are biased, fall short when you look at the standards of bias in a lot of other areas.
Yeah.
The only bias they have was that they wanted people to believe this.
Yeah.
And we say that's true about textbooks. We want people to learn from the textbooks we write.
Yeah.
And so the standard for bias needs to be understood in a way that's realistic and not dismissive.
Okay. 2 things. Katie, I hope you're still with us. The question that you asked, we are going to get to, we want to get to, but I think a thing to answer before we get to that, because that will ask a little more about the resurrection itself, is how can historical sources talk about supernatural events? Don't we all just know that supernatural events just are not possible? Therefore, then the Gospels would be incorrect.
There's a lot of dismissive attitudes about so historical events. We don't have a perfect recollection of history because farther back you go, the more and more people were just trying to survive, and the harder it would be for anything they did make to last until we have it now. And so a lot of history is piecing together the evidence we do have and coming up with the most probable explanation. And so there's a lot of dismissive writing off in historical circles of if it's religious, it's not probable, therefore we don't have to deal with it as historians. Bart Ehrman actually takes the stance that miracles are, by definition, the most improbable occurrence. And so history is the pursuit of the most probable explanation. So historians can never verify, validate, endorse a miracle. He sees that as a contradiction of the job of a historian. And there's some
Which
clear-
would just straight up cancel out all of the gospel accounts. Basically,
It-
all of the New Testament as true historical fact.
well, what it would do is it would take everything supernatural and say that
never happened.
It wouldn't negate the accounts outright. There could still be this guy Jesus who still walked around Galilee, still made radical claims, still got killed because of it. But a lot of these supernatural miracles get thrown out. In the same way that we see like other histories where they throw in like supernatural flair to really say like, hey, this guy's great, and our God agrees that this guy is great. Like it would be that sort of, we can dismiss this part and we just say, is the rest of the facts there? And that's a lot of these people's stance on the New Testament is, yeah, there's some facts there, but a lot of this religious stuff we can just throw out because it's religious. And there's a lot of problems with that. The first being, this assumes, there's sort of two things I want to touch on. One is that a lot of this assumes that God is not an active party in history,
Okay.
which if something is going to be probable, if a miracle was to just happen on its own,
Mhm.
immensely improbable and impossible, really.
Right.
By definition, a miracle would need to have a supernatural agent causing it.
Okay.
And so if we just take the probability of just miracles, little to none. But if we accept that God is an active person who interacts with humans, who has shown up in history, then it's not the probability that a miracle would just occur, it's the probability that God would act.
Yeah.
And that is a very different formula. That's a very different probability, because then that falls back into, does God exist? What is the nature of God? And that sort of thing.
So it becomes more of a question of worldview. Like, do you believe that God is an active participant, or do you believe there is no God, or if there is a God, that he could care less? Right. And so that's really kind of that particular part.
Yeah.
And it changes a probability kind of factor. It makes, when you have an active God, it makes it more probable. When you have a non-active or non-God,
Consistent, yeah.
you know, it makes it basically never going to happen.
And there's another second fallacy in that, which is it sort of goes back to an old argument of David Hume's against miracles, which says that because miracles are so incredibly improbable, we can write them out as practically impossible, in the sense of there is no practical effect to believing that miracles are possible. We can just write them out. And an example I'm going to use to sort of evidence how, and I'll say that he wrote this at a time before probability mathematics had really gone further to where it is today.
Mm-hmm.
And a mathematician today who was aware of this philosophically would see some issues with that. And I'll touch on those, which is, Mike, you appear to be wearing clothes.
I am indeed wearing clothes.
Excellent.
It would be very weird for the stream if I was not.
It'd be
Or for you.
for all of us.
Anybody.
Yeah.
Would feel bad. I'm sorry.
So, Mike, off the top of your head, what is the probability that you are wearing the exact outfit you are wearing?
Oh, man. I don't know. That
I
would
mean-
require me to have thoughts about, I mean,
I mean,
it's very low, because it's not like I looked at this current outfit that I'm wearing, my fun size CCA O-line, D-line, got to rep the squad with my jeans and my black shoes and my socks. You know, it would require me to have thought. I have not. I just put it on.
so based on the
low.
evidence that I am looking at you wearing this outfit, I feel I can say with certainty you are wearing this outfit.
I would agree with that
Okay.
statement.
But let's assume
Okay.
that everyone in the world owns, and this factors in companies and stuff, that in existence there are 5 shirts for every person in the world. 5
Only 5 shirts,
Only
or
5.
everybody
Only
has?
5.
Okay.
As in every person only has 5 shirts.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, yeah.
I was like, if there's only 5 shirts and 5 pair of pants, where I think you're going with this, be like, there's not enough pants or shirts for everybody.
That is correct. No, everyone has.
Change the probabilities.
And I'm intentionally lowballing this to demonstrate the point. 5 shirts, 5 pants, 5 underwear, like 5 of every independent piece of clothing.
Yes.
That's all they have.
Okay.
So, throw out a little rando fact. The Earth weighs about 6 times 10 to the 27th grams.
Okay, 10 times 10 to the 26th. Okay.
It's 27th.
27. That's
Yeah.
a lot of zeros,
Yeah.
just for the record. For those of you who can't visualize that,
It's 27 zeros.
that's how many zeros it is.
So,
27.
the likelihood
Yes.
that you are wearing the exact one shirt you're wearing
Okay.
is 1 times the number of people times the number of shirts. That's 1 in 35 billion. That is, out of all the shirts in the world, that's the one shirt you're wearing.
Okay.
Take that and have it be the pants and the underwear as well. And the chance of that exact pants, shirts, underwear combo being the exact combo you happen to wear, it is less likely that you are wearing that exact combo than if you were to just pick up 1 gram from anywhere in the world and have picked the right gram we were looking for. This includes like the molten core, this includes everything. It is less likely that the one shirt out of all the shirts in the world, the one pants out of all the pants in the world, and the one underwear out of all the underwear in the world are those exact 3. It's less likely for that to happen than to be like, we are looking for one specific gram, and it's that one.
Okay.
And
So what's the point here? Then?
okay, and I will also say if we include 2 socks in the equation,
Yep.
then it becomes less likely that you pick out 1 atom than that exact outfit.
So we're not smaller, guys.
And we're not even talking
Gram
about
is
the
smaller,
jacket.
or
Yeah.
atom is smaller than a gram.
Yes.
Okay.
So the reason being that with the sort of old explanation of the improbability of miracles, we would say, well, it's impossible for you to be wearing that outfit because it's so improbable because of the vast number of available clothes that exact outfit occurred.
Okay.
And what happens is specific evidence can greatly contribute to the probability of something in a way that wasn't initially considered. And conversely, evidence that this event didn't happen, the probability that the opposite is true, also needs to be taken into account.
So like,
the fact that you own all these clothes,
yep.
makes it way more probable that you would wear this specific outfit.
Okay.
The fact that the opposite being true of you not wearing clothes is so improbable, it's more likely that you would be wearing this outfit. And
Okay.
so there's a lot of probability stuff where the more evidence you have, the more you begin to move away from this impossible statistical minute number and approach certainty that extreme things could happen, such as a miracle. So the evidence, Justin, to use this, if we were to say we are certain Jesus died, which historically there's so much
True.
evidence,
Yep.
then stuff happened. There was he was buried. There was an empty tomb. There were post-mortem appearances of Jesus. The disciples' interpretation of what happened was that he had risen from the dead. And so now we're left with, well, what are the evidences for that? With evidences that this account happened, then we have to say, is it more likely that Jesus did rise from the dead, or that he did not. And the less and less certain that we are that any opposite interpretation is true, honestly, it doesn't matter how probable it is if it is the only probable option.
So essentially what you're saying is in the probability model that like Bart Ehrman and Hume is talking about, like, well, they're so not probable they can't happen. What we're saying is, well, because there are all these other evidences, they slowly move the probability models to being certain. And to the point where we're really asking, is it more probable that all of these guys would be wrong, all this evidence would be wrong, or that it's just not going to be a true thing?
Yeah.
That's essentially what you're saying. So
that is saying, like, even with the assumption that God is not a very active party in history and that his acting of a miracle is immensely improbable, even with that, the probability of the resurrection is still very high based on all of these evidences.
Okay. So now if we've answered kind of those, the four kind of independent, contemporary, so like, are they separate sources? Are they written close, or were they spoken close to that time? Do they kind of tell a similar story? Are they sharing that sort of thing? And then are they unbiased? If we've answered all of that, we've kind of explained some of this, like a historical source can talk about a supernatural event, that there's a real probability that the resurrection did happen. With all of those, what are some of the facts that you kind of already hinted on some of them of the resurrection itself?
So there's really four facts that we really want to focus in terms of looking at the historical reliability of the resurrection. And that is, the first one is going to be Jesus's burial. So Jesus was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
in a garden in a new tomb.
Yep. So it's multiply attested by several early independent sources, like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 cites a very early sort of creed. Yes, where it says Jesus, died. Jesus was buried, and Jesus rose again.
Yep.
And so the importance of including that middle section, was buried, goes into a very early attestation that Jesus was buried.
Yeah.
We look at the Gospels. We have some pretty early dates for Mark, and then right after that Matthew, and then Luke, and then John as a capstone. But very early accounts of that, him being put in a tomb. I talked about how Mark, in the compiling of the different sources to compile his book, one of those was, based on the way it's worded and written, was likely before Caiaphas left the high priesthood office, which would have been before 37 AD. And so that's some very early accounts of this is what happened. Also, there's a degree to which things are viewed as historically more likely, and that is if they're embarrassing. So what that means is that, let's say I'm writing about this king, and this whole work is about
maybe more. We can say we're writing about Mike DeWard's football career, right? We're going to write about it. It's about 50 years from now. I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to tell you the account of my football experience. Now, I in a lot of cases, because I'm me, I would like to make me sound pretty cool and awesome, right? So in a lot of cases, if I'm writing that, I'm going to write how many touchdowns I scored and how many sacks I got and interceptions, and I'm super awesome. What I'm going to avoid is the time I jumped off sides my junior year in whatever. It was a playoff game against Cedar Rapids, Washington. I gave them a first down. It was 3rd and short, and I jumped off sides and gave them a first down, and they went on that drive and scored. That's fairly embarrassing for me. I probably wouldn't include that.
And even more so when you look at, you don't have a huge vested interest in people believing your football career.
Correct.
There's a large evidence that this was written because the authors believed it and they wanted other people to believe it. And so the embarrassing aspect to give the ancient world example is, let's say you're trying to like almost deify this king in this like random, Roman or Greek account of like, this guy was super awesome. And then you would include a story about how like this one time, like he made this awful mistake and like maybe he pooped his pants. I don't know. But just like, if it makes it harder to respect your story, it's less likely that you made it up for people to respect your story.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that this is in relation to the burial is that he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea, was a member of the Sanhedrin. That's sort of like the Jewish court that sort of ran the temple, did a lot of these like religious laws. It was a combination of Pharisees and Sadducees. It was like the religious elite, the ones who had just earlier voted unanimously to have Jesus killed. And like maybe he wasn't there for the vote, maybe he voted to have Jesus killed, we don't know. But the fact that it is this supposed member who was just against of this group that was against Christ, against Christianity, it's awkward. And that historians view that as very likely because of the way the first century audience would have read, oh, he was buried by a Sadducee.
That's not cool.
No, and that's in connection to a lot of the reasons that we regard this text as a whole. But in terms of this specific passage, that's an example of an element of historical reliability.
Yep. A little embarrassing fact goes a long way to prove that you're a historically reliable endeavor. Which sounds weird, but it is true. Like when you think about when you're retelling a story, like of your own life, how many of us take that time to make ourselves sound as good as we can? And that's, you want somebody to believe you. You want somebody to believe the best of you. And so when they're sharing these stories, they want people to believe them. You would want them to omit all these really embarrassing things, but they want you to believe all these stories. So they're gonna be, if they really want you to believe it, they're gonna tell you all of the truth, not just the good parts, but exactly what happened.
It shows you're trying to be factual in a way that differs from propaganda.
Yeah. Okay, so that was one.
That the tomb was found empty. And even perhaps more specifically, that it was found empty by a group of women followers. Now we touched, again, we have multiple independent sources. Everyone agrees that the tomb was found empty by female. And we just barely touched on Josephus, but in a different part of Josephus, he talks sort of about women's role in first century Israel.
Yeah.
And that is that they were not credible at all.
Yep. Couldn't use their eyewitness account in court.
No. Jewish court of law would not accept a female testimony. And so it's really, and another thing is that a lot of people will try to say, well, it's normal for the women to have to go and deal with this. But that isn't entirely accurate truth either, because his burial was rushed because of the Passover.
Right.
And
so in the timeline of the way things happen, he dies right before the Sabbath in the afternoon. And the Sabbath, in Jewish tradition, you could only go so far from your house. You could only do so much work. You could only require your servants to do so much work. Like there are really big, heavy, like restrictions on the amount of work, because you're supposed to keep it holy and it's a day of rest, just like God rested on the seventh day. So in that particular case, it was a Saturday. And so when he dies on Friday afternoon, Joseph of Arimathea has to like basically book it to Pilate, be like, give me his body because we gotta get him buried, because otherwise he's gonna have to stay out all night and all day, and nobody wants that for Jesus. So,
And so with this like rush job, there weren't a lot of the sort of funeral things that families do to grieve when they are wrapping up the body. And note that this time that they would let the body rot for a year, and then they would go and they would take the bones and they would put them in a special box, and that would be like the final internment. And so
I didn't know that.
Yep.
You learn something new every day.
And so well, remind me to bring that up again when we talk about how it changed the disciples' views.
Okay.
Okay. So the goal was to have a body rot for a year. And the tomb was already closed. He'd already been there a couple of days.
It had been sealed by guards.
There was really no cultural precedent for the women going and trying to get in anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Like the burial was done.
Yes.
And so there was really no reason why the person visiting the tomb had to be them, as opposed to, say, the prominent male leaders of the church, Peter, John, James. Well, it would be the same name, but I'm talking about James, the brother of John, not James, the brother of Jesus.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
There are lots of
Yeah.
James. Okay, sorry.
And no, it's all good. It's all good. James, the brother of Jesus, was a very prominent leader in the early church throughout the book of Acts. And we see that because James, the brother of John, was a very early martyr. And so we see the death of James, the disciple, fairly early in the book of Acts. And then we see James, the brother of John, continue in leadership throughout the early church and eventually writing the book of James.
Acts 15. Anyways,
All
right.
right. Plug for next week's Devos.
Oh, yeah. Hey, James, if you haven't looked on the Facebook or the Instagram, Josh and I have a message for you. You should go there and check it out and then watch the video. I actually made the Bible study, the North Central Boys. Shout out to my guys. We watched it today on our Zoom call for a small group because we had decided before we decided for the whole group to do James that we were going to do James. So nice. This was the second half of James for me. So anyways, that's what we're doing. So take a look at that cool. If you haven't already. So there you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the fact that this tomb was discovered by women instead of Jesus's prominent male disciples who became leaders in the church, well, what would that have looked like in the first century Israel? Well, from Josephus, we know women's what they say doesn't count for anything.
Yeah.
They are not a trustworthy source. They're too out there. They're not, they don't have the same rigid logic of a man. This is first century view, not my view.
We do not endorse that view.
Yeah.
We just, that is the view that was.
But the environment that this was written in was that women do not have the logic of a man. They cannot be trusted as a source. And so it's super embarrassing for the first witnesses of this empty tomb to be a group of women. Because it's saying, well, who saw that Jesus was raised? Oh, someone you won't believe at all. Oh, like, is someone super unlikely? And it's like, no, you won't trust them. Like,
yeah,
that's
pretty out there, sort of the embarrassing, citing the embarrassing story rule.
Yeah. And it's the case that this is also something that is just very broadly, multiply attested that the tomb was empty.
Right. The question that people kind of raise are how many women? Was it one? Was it two? Was it three? And the answer is it was women.
Yeah.
Correct.
And this sort of confronts the sort of idea that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then, he clearly had a body somewhere. And it would have been super easy for the Jewish authorities to be like, wait, you're worshiping what guy? Oh, you mean this corpse in this tomb that is somehow under my jacket because of the motion I did? So,
they're also magicians. Just kidding.
Apparently.
So it's one of those things. Produce a body is the easiest way to end this. Part of my talk on last Sunday. So I think if that was our two, empty tomb found by women, then we've got he was buried.
Then we have
found.
post-mortem appearances. So
Okay.
what I mean is after Jesus died, post-mortem, he appeared to people. And again, this is multiply attested. And Paul, in his verse, actually says, "Hey, these people are still alive. Go talk to them." Like this is not a case where this is some mystery cabal where he only appeared to like 2 people.
Yeah.
Paul says at one time he appeared to 500, and that's probably
It was Peter, the 12, and then 500.
yeah, and that probably would have occurred in Matthew because there's an event where a lot of Jesus's appearances are kind of out of the blue for the disciple, but there's one where it's like, "Hey, meet me on this mountain in Galilee." He sort of sets it up by appointment, and in the Matthew account it says, "And some doubted." So, but then who doubted? The 12 who had met with him multiple times before and were super bought in? Or was it possible that because there's this appointment to see this resurrected guy at this mountain, a bunch of people showed up?
Yep.
And so a lot of people like to throw out the 500 number to say that's not possible, but very clearly in the Matthew account it is, even though Matthew account doesn't give us a number.
Yep.
And
Okay,
so
so-
the issue with the post-mortem appearances as well is that what is the most likely explanation of these events? And it's not that there's some doppelganger walking around.
So yeah, so some of the things to think about here that some past people put forward. So I think the easiest one that you see is listed in the gospel accounts. In fact, Katie asked a question about it. I don't know if she's here anymore, but it's gone from the queue. But it was simply put, it's redacted. That's but it was like, why did the Jewish leaders say that the disciples stole his body? They picked it up, took it out. What? And
that's a great evidence as well that the tomb was empty, because the Jewish leaders are saying, "Hey, we don't have a body."
Yep.
And so if Jesus was raised from the dead, that is a testament that what he said about God was true. For God to raise him from the dead, that is a testament that God approved of his message.
Yep.
But his message was, "I am God."
So I think there's 2 things to be said about that, because I think I've heard it in debates before where they're like, okay, fine, like I don't care, resurrection doesn't mean much. People get raised all the time in these stories. Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. You've got I can't remember what the other one, but that was kind of like somebody he's just trying to get out of this. Okay, but I think one of the most important parts about this isn't just that Jesus rose from the dead. It's the fact that he claimed he was going to die and he was going to raise. And that was the sign for everyone that he was truly God, that he defeated death. It wasn't just like, he didn't die or he gets raised into heaven like some of the prophets or, that sort of stuff. But the fact that he died and then rose again and told you that is the important things to understand.
Well, and something unique about Jesus's resurrection versus, say, Lazarus or the boy that Jesus raised or the, Old Testament prophets is the case that in those instances, there was a dead body that was made a live body. In Jesus' case, there is a dead body that is resurrected to a glorified body. It was not the simple, I'm going to take this dead guy, this dead normal human, and turning into a living normal human. It is, I'm going to take this dead human who is completely human. He's not normal because he's also completely God, but his body is a completely normal human body. And I'm going to raise him to the glorified state that we will be raised to in the end times. Mm-hmm. It is so it is a different sort of resurrection than what we see with Lazarus what we see with the Jairus's daughter, what we see with the young boy, what we see with the Old Testament prophets is a new form of this sort of resurrection, which actually ties into the fourth point of the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. So there's
that a little bit.
So to unpack that a little bit, Jesus was not the only person to claim to be the Messiah in the first century. There were in the first century BC, first century AD, there were several. But you see this trend with all these claimers, which is they started to get a following, the leader was killed, and they disbanded. And we actually see in the Gospels that the high priests, the Sanhedrin, were like, hey, if we kill Jesus, they go away just like every other messianic pretender.
Now that I think the Pharisees and Sadducees kind of get a bad rap for that sort of thing, and they really shouldn't have done it because he was truly the Messiah. But that was kind of their part of the role that they played within Israel, was they were to figure out who was the true Messiah and make sure to stop anybody who was a false Messiah. And so in their mind, they were doing a completely righteous and good thing, even though on the outside, you can see kind of, as they have all these different interactions with Jesus.
Their definition of a Messiah is someone who would be like, hey, you guys are doing exactly what I wanted.
Yep. And you don't like Rome. I don't like Rome. Let's get them out of here and we'll win.
Well, yeah, and that's the messianic expectations were for a leader who would triumph over Israel's enemies, and instead, Jesus was shamefully executed as a criminal. And so all cultural expectations would be either we find a new leader or we just disband and we don't talk about this again.
Right. And in most of the gospel accounts is kind of similar to what happened to them before they saw a risen Jesus. You get guys going back to fishing, like, all right, well, I'm out. And you get other guys who are just like hiding in a room,
This was not supposed to happen.
Yep.
I believed he was the Messiah, and the Messiah is a conquering hero. He just got killed by Rome.
Yep.
And by the Jewish authorities. And there was also this Jewish belief about the afterlife and what and the end times looked like, where they believed, the ones who believed in a resurrection, believed that the resurrection was an end times event, and where Israel and its faithful, they would rise at the end times. There was no concept of a resurrection before the end times. There was no expectation for it. And so the idea of what would happen if Jesus was actually endorsed by God would have been along the lines of what happened when a prophet was killed, which is, he gets brought up to the presence of God. And so the disciples' visions based on their entire worldview would have been, hey, if they were faking, it would have been like, hey, I had a vision of Jesus by God's side, being endorsed by God up there, which means that we continue down here. Mm-hmm. But the resurrection happened where, for a period of time afterwards, Jesus was present down here, was still on earth. He was resurrected on earth before the end times. And that was this completely new foreign idea that wasn't part of Jewish understanding at all.
And really, arguably, no religion to that point.
Yeah.
Because there's a fairly outdated, I think, idea, but you can still get it kicked around a little bit of where Christianity is just a copycat religion. Like, there are lots of gods who've risen from the dead. And so our kind of argument against that would be, first, all of the ones that you're seeing, all of the ones that you're going to hear about, the stories might be that God rose again, but it was purely selfish reasons, almost entirely. Like just in the Egyptian, it's Osiris or something.
Yeah. And even then there's a means of he was stitched back together by his wife, and gets weird, but
So, I mean, in order to say something along those lines, they would have to match up more clearly. But what you really truly get is like, well, this completely different account of this guy raising from the dead with almost no bearing to the Jesus story. Yeah, that must have fueled this Jesus story. That seems like really outdated. Plus, it's not like the Jews were super interested in like taking from other people's
they were
religions.
actively interested in not taking from other people's religions.
Again, that is the whole point of like the Sanhedrin and the Pharisees. They're meant to keep Israel on track.
Not to mention, if you're looking at correlations between the story of a dude getting resurrected, why not start with the Old Testament prophets who raised someone from the dead? Why not start with the stories of people Jesus had risen from the dead? And why go to this entirely different sort of resurrection where you are being resurrected now before the end times in a glorified state in a way that was just completely foreign to everyone's concept of how this would work? And so this was another example where the sell here was hard. And a lot of these facts, it's like a hard sell to convince someone this is the way it happened, because there's a lot of embarrassing details. There's a lot of this goes against any mindset prior to this. And we see later accounts where these are embellished into almost legendary details, like Gospel of Thomas or Peter, I think, has a cross at the grave telling the women about Jesus's resurrection. And clearly that didn't happen. That was a later embellishment. And there's a reason that we don't view that as scripture.
Part of the Gnostic movement, where knowledge can be gained through thoughts.
And there's this idea that body equals bad, spirit equals good.
Yes.
And so there was even a case that like, well, Jesus didn't have a body at all because body equals bad and spirit equals good. And it's like, well, how do you get nailed to a cross? Well, body equals bad, spirit equals good.
So this is that leads us to an entirely different, like, how do we get the canon of scripture is kind of a super important kind of topic to have about why, like, the Gospel of Thomas isn't there, and we have the Gospel of John and the three synoptic gospels, and
when we say Thomas and Peter, we mean that's what they were named, not that's what they were written by.
Yeah, they weren't, and they very clearly was not like a guy followed those two around and then wrote their accounts. It was like a guy like 100+ years later was like,
it's early Christian fanfic.
They wrote their own fan fiction. Hey, if you have any questions at all, you can post it on the live chat. I just kind of want to open it up here. I don't know if we have anything.
So while we wait for a bit, if we can take these four facts: Jesus' burial, discovery of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and the disciples' belief, and the origin of this belief that was so countercultural to anything that came before it in terms of how resurrection worked, when it happened, all of this other details that conflicted with the pre-existing understanding, we are then left with what is the best explanation of the evidence. Because in most New Testament scholarly circles, there's not a disagreement of this evidence. There's a disagreement on the explanation of the evidence. There's a desire to say, hey, those post-mortem appearances were visions, hallucinations.
Those don't hold up.
But there's not, but that's in relation to the explanation for what they were, not the argument for did they happen.
Yeah.
There's, what's the best explanation for this radical new belief? What's the best explanation for this empty tomb? And that's where we go back to this probability thing, where we look at, let's say, and this is a whole other topic, but let's just say it is possible that there is a God who acts in the world on occasion. let's just say just that. And so then we're left with, what is the best explanation of these historical facts that are agreed upon in this setting? And there's really no good explanation for these historical facts besides God acted in this way of raising Jesus from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like if we don't include like that part, we sort of are just like listing facts and we're not getting to why these facts are important. They're important because the evidence, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this miracle could have happened. That makes it far more probable.
Mm-hmm.
There's also evidence that makes it unlikely that alternative interpretations are correct, which also makes it far more likely. And so what we're left is not this menial percentage of super unlikely. We're left with this evidences, the best interpretation is clearly that Jesus rose from the dead and that it was not, these facts are not better explained by any other means.
Okay. Why did the disciples scatter after Jesus was killed, even though he told them that he would rise again?
So we see that the disciples were fixed in the same Jewish mindset that everyone was, which is, what does it mean to be resurrected? What does it mean to when you die? And it wasn't that there would be an immediate resurrection. It would be there would be a resurrection in the end time. And as well, you look at Jesus had to really take some time with the disciples afterwards to really be like, hey, here's how the Old Testament points to me. Here's how these prophecies were fulfilled, because the disciples really missed a lot on that first go through.
Yeah, you think the way I would kind of I think answer this is you think about how many times Jesus was like, you idiots. Like he didn't say that, but he was like, come on, guys, like I just explained the truth, and you're like, can I sit at your right hand when you come to power? Like, he's like, I'm telling you, I'm going to die. And they're like, cool. So when you defeat Rome, like, can I be in the highest position?
Like, where am I going to be in this like post-Rome hierarchy?
And so when Jesus dies, when he gets handed over, you see like Peter, I think is a very clear kind of like, all right, you're trying to take my Lord. Let me cut off that servant's ears. Like, let me fight him because we're not.
Well, there's a soldier over there. You want to?
No, I wanted that guy, the unarmed guy.
Yeah, okay.
That's the one. I'm fighting that guy, and
Okay.
the other guys will take care of the guards. But that's kind of this, this idea that we're going to eventually overthrow. Like, you got to believe that they're holding out hope through the trial, through the march up to Golgotha, to putting him on the cross, that when those guys get up there and mock them, and they're there, like it's, they're watching in mourning because they were holding out hope this whole time that, hey, he's the Messiah. He's going to come in power. And even though he was saying things like, if you destroy this temple, I'll build it back in 3 days. I'll come back. They're like, cool. You mean the actual temple, right? He's like, no. They're like, got it.
He means the actual temple.
Yeah, I know. So that would be like my answer. I think that's kind of the idea.
That's what we see a lot in the scriptures, is this mindset that they're missing it until he comes back. He's like, hey, I need to sit you down and I need to go through all of it with you again, because the first time through, you missed it.
You missed it. You done missed it, Ron. I think that's a lot. Anybody else? We would much rather answer questions than not. One of the things, if you're waiting to answer or ask one, I think one of the things the reason why we do this is because we're all supposed to have an account, to be able to give an account for the faith that we have. And one of the things that truly separates Christianity from almost all of the other religions, I think you could arguably say separates it from every other religion, is the fact that it's mired, like dug deep into a historical event. Now, what I mean by that is we're not talking about like what is it, Joseph? What's his name? Who's basically
Smith.
Yeah, Joseph Smith, the hardest name to remember ever. Yeah. Who was like, oh yeah, Jesus came to the New World and he gave me some plates and I found them, I read them, and then I lost them. And so just trust me, I got it. Or, like Muhammad, I went into a cave, I heard from God, I came out of the cave. Now let me, share with everybody. And if you don't like it, eventually I'm going to get to the point where we're just going to take you over. Okay. Or even Moses, who I love, he seems like a fine dude after he meets the burning bush, but he meets the burning bush off by himself. He goes to a mountain all by himself. But here you have God incarnate, Jesus coming back, dying a physical death. That means there is a dead body somewhere. And then rising again, appearing to people. This is an event that has basically never happened before and did not happen after. This is a one in a lifetime, one in apparently the entire world event. And that's what we believe in. That's what we're arguing for or against. And so when you start talking to people about Christianity, they're going to want to go in about 1,000 different ways. They're going to want to talk about equality, or they're going to want to talk about church history, or they're going to want to talk about tradition that they don't agree with. And the answer is, we may all struggle with some of that stuff, but if Jesus died on the cross and rose again and was 100% God and 100% man, then he's the one that we follow with everything we've got. And if I can get that, if I can show you the evidence that makes that the most likely event that happened, rather than just like, well, these 12 guys who just made it up, or these 11 guys, they made it up, and then they all recounted later, and we stuck with it. Well, that would be a worthless faith. That's why Paul writes in a lot of his letters, like, look, if Christ is still dead and didn't raise up, then we don't have faith. We don't have a faith. We should be pitied beyond all other people. And so what you end up getting a lot of times when you start to have these conversations with people, and I would suggest just start easy. Just ask them what they know about the resurrection. What do they believe actually happened? What do they believe about the New Testament? That's why you have to kind of set up that the New Testament is a reliable document. If you're wondering, there are some good books. Cold Case Christianity, you can't read this, it's too bright. If you want to, that's kind of an easier read. Forensic Faith is by the same guy, J. Warner Wallace. If you want a super nerdy one, this one is Evidence That Demands a Verdict by the McDowells. That's Josh and Sean, their father-son. And this thing has gone through many different additions and addendums, and they continue to add on to it. But this book is like encyclopedia sort of thing. And it goes through like questions of like how we got the Bible, how is the New Testament historically reliable, the Old Testament, composition of the Pentateuch, we've got the martyrdom of the apostles, truth of nature, knowability of truth, answering postmodernism. So like if you're looking for kind of a catch-all book, this is one that's huge. You can't keep it like it's not a pocket book. These other ones are good. The Cold Case Christianity is a homicide or former homicide detective investigating the gospel, and I think it's really important he does a really good job of coming at it from a case and evidence point in the way that I think a lot of people understand. We all kind of like watch the cop shows and CSI and that sort of stuff. So maybe not anymore. CSI is not really a thing, is it? I don't know. But
NCIS.
NCIS, that's still going 35 years later.
I think it's still going.
Anyways, that's like a little bit easier to understand. He's probably not as I would say as booked learned as maybe the McDowells in the sense of like he kind of attacks it from I think the common man sort of thing. It's a little more, I think, easy to understand than the other stuff. It's an easier read. He's a significantly more like in the ground sort of person. I feel bad saying that about him. He's a brilliant guy, and I think he's super smart. He was a cold case detective, and he was really good at his job. And so cold case sort of studies is very similar to this, of where you don't have access to the eyewitness anymore. All you have are like depositions and stuff like that, and you don't really have DNA, so you got to figure it out, piece it together, and then be 100% certain about your findings at the end. And he does a really, really good job of kind of explaining that and going through that.
And one thing I will say that we haven't touched on is the crucifixion. There's a degree to which proving that Jesus rose from the dead first dictates that Jesus actually died.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't touched on that because there's such a large body of historical evidence that Jesus actually died. The gospel accounts, the way that it describes Jesus, it's pretty irrefutable that he died. The accounts outside of the gospel are like, Josephus was like, hey, there's this dude Jesus, and he died. And so the crucifixion is not really contested in academic circles. And so we haven't really dealt with, did Jesus physically die?
Yeah.
But it is important to understand the resurrection, to understand that there was a dead body to be resurrected.
Yeah, that really leads to, if you understand anything about Rome and about the way that it handled its business, it was not afraid to kill people. It was not afraid to kill many people in very painful, efficient ways. This was a brutal, like, regime, and they were brutal for a reason. You can head a lot of rebellions off at the pass if you just kill people awfully, because most people don't want to die awfully. And the cross is ultimately probably their pinnacle of like death and embarrassment. They would typically strip you completely naked. They'd put you on this tree. People would be paraded around in front of you like you were in a very public place. So not only was it embarrassing, like to be all of that, then it was excruciating because you're out in the elements. Okay, you're suffocating. The only way to breathe is by pushing up on the joints, basically where they have nailed you onto this piece of wood. And so just on that, so to breathe, it was excruciatingly painful. And it was just hard. And then a lot of times they beat you before that. So you like, man, they were good at what they did. And so that's why people really don't debate it, because the swoon theory, as it's called, is that Jesus, he swooned, he faked his death, and then they stabbed him in the heart with a spear and he was fine. So, yeah.
Not only that, but then he stumbles out of the grave.
Not stumble, he walks. He's a man.
Well, after being so brutally tortured that it's believed he's dead, and then he's just left in the grave for 3 years or 3 days. He crawls his way out of the
unbelievable.
Yeah, crawls his way out of the funeral cloth wrap, whatever, and stumbles out, and then the disciples are like, that looks like a perfect representation of Jesus, not someone who needs dire medical attention.
Yes, and that also does not like the way that tombs are built back in the day was they would put the stone in front of the door, and like I think by most accounts what I've read is at least like a 4 foot in diameter. Diameter all the way across. So this stone, and they would groove it in, so it's not like it could pop out this way. Like you couldn't push it out from the inside. You had to roll it one way or the other. And I don't know if you guys have lifted a lot of weights or done any of that stuff, but let me tell you, having tried to pick rocks up, a 4 foot in diameter stone is not one that is easy to move, and especially not quietly. So like the idea that the disciples somehow SEAL Team 6 snuck in and move the stone, remove the body, and then claim that he was resurrected and did all this crazy stuff in Acts. Just, man, it doesn't point to it. One of the things we talked about is when people say, no one will die for a lie. Okay, it's kind of we say that a lot. The truth is, some people would die for a lie. It's just unlikely, very, very unlikely that 11 of them would die and not recount for a lie. Like if it was your get out of jail free card, and let me tell you, look, if you're going to be martyred and the options are, I'm going to throw you in this boiling pot of oil until you die, or you can tell me that Jesus didn't really raise and you hid his body, and then I'm going to parade you everywhere else, but you stay alive and you don't boil alive, I would say at least 1 out of the 11 probably is going to buckle. Okay. One of them is going to be like, no, I'm out. Okay. And I mean, again, you think that these authorities that are in place are trying to get rid of this Jesus tale. And so I think I was listening to one debate where I think the guy was like, who is to say they were given an option to recount, or, they would be killed? Maybe they're just going to get killed. And that leads to an idea that they were not actively trying to get rid of this. And in many cases, they were told, stop talking about this or we're going to kill you.
Yeah, they were not trying to exterminate the apostles. They were trying to exterminate the religion.
And so the fact that you end up with this kind of like series of guys who end up dying and dying and dying and not in largely like horrific ways. Okay. There's accounts that Peter gets crucified upside down.
Well, Peter was going to be crucified. And then the story is he didn't feel worthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. So he asked to be crucified upside down. That's sort of like the church tradition story of it.
So, I mean, whether or not, like killed, yes.
Yeah.
And like awful. And then you hear the accounts of like where they're like, I was beaten and I was stoned and I was like, you would think that these guys, that at a certain point, if the goal was just like start a new religion, that they would be like, I'm tired of getting stoned by people. I'm tired of people throwing like real live rocks at me. Sorry, rocks are not alive. They're
like real physical.
Yes. Real physical stones.
Not virtual.
It's not like GTA where your star goes up. It's like they're really almost dying. Like I don't know if you've ever gotten hit with a rock, but it is not fun.
Yeah, generally if someone tries to create a religion, it is not to get martyred.
Yes. Yeah. Correct. I think that's always something to think about. So I think we're going to end it here. We're almost an hour and a half in. And if you really were here the whole time, I'm proud of you, quite frankly. I find this stuff to be wildly interesting and really helps affirm my faith. There is always a level of this that I will tell you. It is faith-based because nobody can ever prove anything to like 100%. But I mean, we can get pretty close to 100% in a lot of things, and this is one. That all of the evidence mostly points to the fact that these guys really saw this, they really believed it, they really lived it out, and Jesus really did die, rise again, and then ascend. And I think that's important to be said.
So if you have any questions you want us to go over in the future, go ahead and email us.
Email pvstudentmin
at gmail.com.
At Gmail. Or you can do mdeward@parkviewchurch.org, or you can do mikedeward@ccaschools.org.
Or message us on Instagram.
Or you can direct message us on Instagram or Facebook. We got lots. I wish we had a Twitch, but we don't.
You can mail
someday.
us.
You can mail it. 15 mail. Foster Road.
Iowa City, Iowa.
52240.
5.
Hey, some lady is walking her dog out the window. It's a good time to walk your dog. Yeah. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you. But we're going to see you now. Oh, okay.